Hello, I'm Dr. Malescu, and I'm going to be discussing today just a short micro lesson on metabolism and what metabolism is all about. Basically, it's consumption of energy based on input versus output. So input means food and drink, and so the food and drink has energy, and so we use that for our movement. So our lean muscle mass is going to use the contents of that food in the form of energy. And so at the molecular level, even at the cellular level, the smallest unit would be adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. So ATP is a very small molecule. And this is the molecule, I know I'm saying it's small, there's actually much larger molecules than this one. And so adenosine triphosphate is the energy molecule for a particular cell. So any cell at any point in your body will have ATP stored and ATP used. And the mitochondria, which is, as we all heard this coined term, we heard powerhouse of the cell is the mitochondria. Well, this is where adenosine triphosphate is made in the mitochondria. And so we use the adenosine triphosphate, our cells use it to create the energy that's needed for their metabolic needs, so whatever the cell needs. So during, for example, catabolic reactions, breaking down larger molecules into smaller molecules, ATP is used to create that energy. So ATP is created via that catabolic mechanism. And so the ATP is going to be the major energy storage until any kind of buildup is needed. So for example, the cell needs to build up something to make something, right? So we could talk about anything from protein synthesis to any kind of cellular reaction. ATP is required. We talk about active transport, moving against the concentration gradient. We're going to need some energy. So we're going to use the ATP. The cell is going to use that ATP. All right. So again, to circle back to the original discussion on ATP, basically adenosine triphosphate is the energy molecule of the cell. And during any kind of catabolic reaction, we actually create that ATP. Our cells create that ATP and store it. So the mitochondria is the location of this ATP. And so when we need to build, when our cells need to build something, okay, anabolic means to build, any kind of anabolic reaction or any kind of cellular processes, your ATP is going to be utilized in the form of energy expended to make that action happen. So adenosine triphosphate has high energy bonds. And so here you can see the bonds, and the catabolic reaction will release the energy used in any kind of buildup or anabolic reaction. So that ATP, when it gets broken down, it is going to release energy, and the product is adenosine diphosphate instead of adenosine triphosphate. We could also go in the opposite direction, and this would be buildup, right? So we can go from adenosine diphosphate. An anabolic reaction means that we're going to actually take that chemical reaction, and so that the energy that's released is actually going to create this final product, adenosine triphosphate. So as you can see, energy is required in order to go from ADP to ATP. In anabolic reactions, we store the energy released from a catabolic reaction. So in this direction, we are creating a larger molecule, adenosine triphosphate. In this direction, this is the catabolic, where we're actually breaking it down from ATP to ADP and releasing energy. That energy is released, right? So we release energy to be used in any kind of buildup or anabolic reaction in the cell. So I hope that was super clear. So sources of ATP, obviously, as I mentioned, food and drink. So the general breakdown of the food that we eat. It's either going to be a protein source, complex or simple carbohydrate source, and triglycerides, lipids, fats. So amino acids are the building blocks that when you have a polypeptide chain of amino acids, you build up into protein. So as you can see here, complex carbohydrates can become simple sugars like glucose, simple carbohydrates, and that energy is used. So glucose can be a way of producing that energy needed to go from ADP to ATP, and then ATP can be stored and used in this direction. As you saw, ATP can be used for energy release, and the byproduct is ADP. All right, but in order to go from ADP to ATP, you actually need to add in energy. So to get that energy, you get it from amino acids, from glucose, and triglycerides are made up of backbone of glycerol and 3 fatty acids. So that's going to be another source of energy. If we have plenty of excess and we don't need to use it as energy, we're going to store it as fat, lipid synthesis and storage. So that's how we get our source of ATP. During catabolic reactions, proteins are broken down into amino acids, lipids are broken down into fatty acids, and polysaccharides are broken down into simple sugars like glucose. And so these are the building blocks that are then used for the synthesis molecules in anabolic reactions. Now let's talk about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration means that you're oxidizing the glucose, which is a form of energy, right? And through the process of glycolysis, right? So the breakdown of the stored glucose is glycogen, right? So when we oxidize glucose, we undergo what's called the Krebs cycle, and we release ATP. So every time we take a glucose molecule, we can see it as a potential energy source. And as it goes through this Krebs cycle of metabolic reactions, it will actually produce ATP. Now, you're lucky we don't have to go through the actual chemical processes and understand the biochemistry behind this, but I am going to go through the most simplistic flow chart here, showing you how glucose can be broken down into 2 pyruvate molecules, and then the pyruvate is going to be broken down into acetyl-CoA, which then is going to go through this circle called and there's a number of chemical reactions here that is not demonstrated in this flow chart, but that's called the Krebs cycle. And the product of Krebs cycle is that you release CO2, but the most important product is what we need, which is that ATP stored energy. And this all occurs in the mitochondria. And as it continues the process past the Krebs cycle, you can move into the oxidative phosphorylation, where the electrons from the original chemical structure of these molecules, the outer electron shells can be removed from glucose pyruvate. And so as we do this stepwise process, we're going to result in even more ATPs, as you can see here. And all of this results in the formation of water. Now, let's talk about glycolysis overview. So glycolysis overview is basically that you have energy consumption. So we're going to consume and use up the ATPs that started from that original glucose. So you can see here you have 1 glucose molecule, 2 ATPs are consumed. And so what is the product? It's the product is the transfer of these phosphates. Okay, so as we consume the ATP, we are going to take these phosphates and we're able to transfer the 2 phosphates to this glucose molecule. So now we have a glucose molecule with phosphates. All right, so now what? The glucose molecule then splits into 3 carbon compounds, and at this point each have a phosphate. All right, and so each time we have a reaction, we need ATP to go to ADP. So that is a reaction to create the energy to be able to do this. So now we have this phosphorylation where each of these molecules have the phosphate, right? So the glucose molecule splits into the 3 carbon compounds, each containing a phosphate. The energy for this endergonic reaction is going to provide oxidation or removal of 2 electrons from each of the 3 carbon compounds. During this energy release, the phosphates are removed so that both 3 carbon compounds are used to make more ATP. So that's that process. Now, what about aerobic versus anaerobic? So aerobic respiration is going to be able to convert the glucose into lactate molecules, and this is the reaction that happens after you've been working out and you've used all your glucose and have no more ATP left. You're going to move into the anaerobic respiratory phase. So in the anaerobic respiratory phase, you convert the glucose into 2 lactate molecules. There is no oxygen involved. So over here, if you note, we had oxygen involved in the process. Let's see if I can find where that is. Can't see in this image. But the anaerobic involves no oxygen. That's what anaerobic means, absence of oxygen. So during the aerobic respiratory phase, the glucose is then oxidized into 2 pyruvates. So the 2 pyruvate molecules are utilized by the cell for energy when when you run out of glucose. All right, so during the Krebs cycle, each and every single pyruvate that's generated by glycolysis is going to convert the 2 carbon acetyl-CoA molecules. And so these are systematically processed through a very long cycle of chemical reactions that are going to produce these molecules, NADH, FADH2, and the end product, which is what we need, which is ATP. So ATP molecules are produced. So the electron transport chain, each time you have the electron transport chain occur, a series of electron carriers and ion pumps are used. And so the hydrogen is pumped out of the mitochondria. And of course, the great news is we're making more and more ATP. And that's why we call the mitochondria the powerhouse of the cell. Now, what about carbohydrate metabolism? This involves a breakdown of glucose. So we're doing glycolysis. It involves Krebs cycle, and it also involves the electron transport chain, which you can see in this image. Stepwise transfer of electrons until you finally reach a whopping number of 36 ATP molecules. So in the end, out of all of this craziness, with glycolysis, you make 2 ATPs. With Krebs cycle, you make 2 ATPs. But with the electron transport, once you go through all these processes, the electron carriers per glucose is huge. And as those electrons get transferred, your end result of all these reactions is 36 ATPs per glucose, which is a heck of a lot of energy. So this is why glucose is a potential storage of 36 ATPs. All right, now what happens if you're starving and you haven't had any glucose in your system? Gluconeogenesis is making glucose from things that are not glucose, right? So gluconeo, meaning again, genesis, to make glucose again. We can make glucose from pyruvate. We can make glucose from lactic acid. We can make glucose from glycerol, alanine, and glutamate, meaning non-carb sources. We can use alanine and glutamate, which are amino acids, and convert them to glucose. And this is what happens in the body, in the liver, gluconeogenesis. When you're in starvation mode, you're releasing glucose into the bloodstream thanks to the hormone from the alpha cells in the pancreas. So we have insulin when the body is full of glucose in the blood. And then we have glucagon when blood glucose is not full and it's low, those reserves are low, like let's say glucose is lower than 50, then the gluconeogenesis occurs simply because glucagon is released by the pancreas. And so the liver is going to undergo this process of gluconeogenesis. All right, now what about the 3 fatty acids and the lipids, right? So you're going to have the triglycerides breaking down into a monoglyceride. So you can have the 3 fatty acid tails and the backbone of a triglyceride molecule. So this is what a fat looks like, and we can break down into a monoglyceride by having just 1 fatty acid. All right, and then finally in this lesson, there are something in the cells called chylomicrons. These contain triglyceride and cholesterol molecules, as well as lipoproteins, which is a combo of obviously protein and fat. And so their function is to carry water-soluble molecules from the intestine through the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system has these projectile structures called lacteals within the villi of the intestinal cells. And so as we can transport through the lymphatic system and into the bloodstream, we can carry these lipids and store them as fat in our body. All right, so how do we break down the fatty acids? The triglycerides can be broken down into acetyl-CoA, and it's used for energy only when glucose levels are low. So this is what happens like during a diet per se, right? Your glucose levels are low, you're not eating, you're counting your calories, and so now you're burning the fat, okay? And so this is an example of fatty acid breakdown. So when you break down fatty acid and you go into ketogenesis, you're actually doing yourself a favor by breaking down other stored possible molecules, including proteins. So here you have acetyl-CoA and you have HMG-CoA, and the reactions are going to result in beta-hydroxybutyrate. So you have the transfer of these hydrogens. It's just a change in the hydrogen structure. That's all it is that makes the difference between this reaction going to this chemical and this chemical going to beta-hydroxybutyrate. So excess acetylcholine is always, acetyl-CoA is diverted into the Krebs cycle for ketogenesis, and the result is the production of beta-hydroxybutyrate, which is a ketone body that's found in your blood. And if the ketone bodies are too high, they spill over in the urine. And this is something that we worry about with diabetes. So when glucose is limited, we form ketone bodies. And this is why the body has hyperglycemia in diabetes, but the cells aren't getting the glucose. So we go down that ketone oxidation, because ketone bodies can produce the acetyl-CoA to be used in the Krebs cycle to generate energy in the absence of glucose. So lipid metabolism means that we're breaking down. There are several pathways of metabolism of lipids. And so we have the glycerol and fatty acids. They both follow very different pathways. So this is not a biochemistry course, but know that they do follow different pathways. And so we can have digestive enzymes and hormones that will assist in the breakdown of proteins into amino acids in the stomach. And we also have the urea cycle, in which the nitrogen, there's transfer of ammonia. So nitrogen is transaminated, where the ammonia changes from NH4 to NH3. And so the changes in the structure is going to result in urea. So ammonia is processed in the urea cycle to produce urea that we're going to get rid of in the urine. Energy from amino acids can be broken down into precursors for glycolysis or to be used in Krebs cycles. So the amino acids like phenylalanine, tyrosine, leucine, lysine, and tryptophan, as well as isoleucine, these are going to be part of the keto oxidation. And as we go through these reactions, we are going to create the pathway towards resulting ATP energy. So catabolic and anabolic pathways are basically very important for the body to transfer the nutrients into energy. So we call that anabolism. And breaking down products or metabolites is called catabolism. So when we catabolize, we release energy. And when we want to build or store energy, anabolism, that comes from the nutrients that we can ingest. All right, so the absorptive state occurs at the gut, at the small intestine. And so our liver cells are going to process fats, store fats, glucose, you know, everything else, proteins. Excess fats can be stored in adipose cells, and the muscle cells are obviously going to pick up glucose in the form of glycogen storage. Now, what about the post-absorptive state? During the post-absorptive state, the body must rely on the energy storage that we have. So the storage that we have in our fat cells, the storage that we have in the form of glycogen in the muscle, and also glycogen in the liver cells, alongside other things like fat storage and things like that. Fats, carbs, and proteins, right? Which is basically the main source. Your liver is going to be the motherboard for providing energy. All right, so in the end, who controls all of this is the hypothalamus, because the hypothalamus is going to control when you're hungry and when you're thirsty. And this is an amazing regulation of homeostasis. And also the hypothalamus regulates your body temperature. And so if the temperature is too high, you're going to release heat, and if the temperature is too low, you're going to release your erector pili muscle to have like goosebumps. So there are many ways to look at thermoregulation of the hypothalamus. All right, so in the end, the MyPlate method is super important in terms of having a healthy body, because as you saw, we need carbs, we need lipids, and we need carbohydrates. So you need a balanced diet of fruits, grains, proteins, and vegetables. So I hope this lesson was useful for you. Sorry that my bird was loud today, but I had another PowerPoint that I did, which was way shorter and during the week in my office, but the sound wasn't working. So here I am on a Saturday doing the video again. All right, talk to you later. Bye.